The Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis are two consoles that I love. But here's the thing, how much I love them can be a problem. There I am having fun, but maybe too much fun. It can be hard to stop. Playing an hour of Super Mario World, followed by an hour of Sunset Riders, followed by an hour of some Contra 3 only makes sense. But naturally, I get stopped by this stupid thing called other parts of my life. So annoying. How are there still dirty dishes after my dish-free strategy to marathon Donkey Kong all day? But no matter what I do, turns out video games can't be the only thing I do. That said, worry not, because I've got a solution. Introducing consoles that are sort of fun. Just fun enough to do the job, but not too fun that they're hard to put down. Check me out playing some Atari Jaguar. Having fun, but ready to do some other stuff after a while, allowing me to be a normal adult who uses things like shame and self-guilt to be productive. A minute wasted is $1 lost. Now, when it comes to comparing the Atari Jaguar to the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, I want to mention something that I feel is really important to keep in mind while considering some of the hate that the Atari Jaguar gets, which is the Atari Jaguar is still a video game console, which is automatically a good thing. Just because it is not as good of a console as some people might have hoped, doesn't mean I'm going to rank it below some of the other worthless junk that can't even claim to be a video game console. I mean, can your window blinds play NBA Jam? Yeah, score one for the Jag. But unfortunately for the Jag, at least in this video, it's being compared to the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, some of the most beloved game consoles ever made. Some people might disagree that the Jaguar should even be compared to these two consoles, given it initially released in 1993, whereas the Super Nintendo initially released in 1990 in Japan, and the Genesis in 1988 in Japan. But the Jaguar targeted the Genesis and Super Nintendo in its advertising when it came out, so I think it's fair game. Most famously, it targeted them with its infamous claim of being a 64-bit console, as opposed to the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, which were 16-bit. And claim to be 16-bit. Careful how many bits you claim to be. People will debate it for decades to come. I've caught my TurboGrafx 16 thanking the Jag for making it look good by comparison. I've also been caught myself trying to make debatable claims. The Jaguar's claim of being 64-bit wasn't fooling many people. Thought of by many as your classic 90s deceptive marketing dirty doggery. With the tagline of "Do the math," Atari was ironically doing their own math, with the reasoning being that when adding the Jaguar's two 32-bit custom coprocessors together, named Tom and Jerry, no, I'm not kidding, it added up to equal 64 bits, but no 64-bit instruction set like later 64-bit consoles would have. I really have to keep an eye on my Jaguar. All this said, there are still those who disagree and will argue that the Jaguar is indeed 64-bit, using arguments such as the console having a 64-bit data path. The conversation can get even more technical from here, but in any case, Atari's strategy of positioning the console as a 64-bit console ultimately didn't lead to sales numbers that came anywhere close to the success that consoles like the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo enjoyed, with the general consensus being that the Jaguar was simply not as good. But that was then. What about now? After all, we are retro gamers who are all about giving consoles another chance. I mean, the PS2 murdered the beloved Dreamcast, and I've still found it in my heart to forgive and forget. When it comes to the Jaguar, starting with my personal opinion, I found the Atari Jaguar to be a far more enjoyable console than I would have guessed. Regardless of how many bits you consider the console to be, it still feels more capable than the Genesis and Super Nintendo in a lot of ways, and was put to good use for some games at least. There's definitely a lot of games games that feel like what you'd find on 16-bit consoles, likely because developers found the hardware difficult to work with and fully optimize. But games like NBA Jam sure look great. What a game! And what I feel is a huge improvement over the 16-bit versions. I will say though, the Atari Jaguar is definitely hurting in the great exclusives department, something that tends to happen with most consoles that were commercial failures. If a publisher thinks that they have a great game on their hand, they're usually going to try their darndest to make sure that game finds its way to somewhere it will actually sell. The Wii U knows what I'm talking about. The truth of the matter is that the Genesis and Super Nintendo absolutely demolished the Jaguar when it comes to the sheer number of quality exclusives that they have, due in large part to the quantity and quality of the developers making games for their system. It's really pretty simple. Get enough great developers on board and your system is gonna be awesome. Many of the best developers of the time, like Squaresoft, Capcom, Konami, Rareware, Treasure, Nintendo themselves, Sega themselves, and many others, they weren't making games for the Jaguar. And really, a big part of the problem is that because Atari is an American company, and many of the developers I listed were Japanese companies, there was very little incentive for them to support the Jaguar. That's right, Japanese developers, you know, the kings of game development for home consoles during the 90s, but still, it's not like nobody outside of Japan could make a good video game. Just look at the PC side of things, which, sure enough, the Jaguar had some PC ports. I personally really enjoy the port of Wolfenstein 3D, and even outside of games that earned their stripes on the PC, the Jaguar managed to land some really big, attention-grabbing IPs. NBA Jam, Alien vs. Predator, and of course, one of my personal favorites, Rayman, which was a big deal even if it was a brand new IP at the time. And even though a decent chunk of its best games are not exclusives, I'd like to point out that the only thing more exclusive than an exclusive is a specific version of a multi-plat game that nobody would ever bother to port to something else, a specialty of the Atari Jaguar. Well, other than some sort of dedicated Atari collection, I suppose. But the Jaguar has a bunch of really interesting versions of games, versions of popular games that many people have never played and probably never will play. NBA Jam on the Jaguar is known for being one of the best versions you can play, and playing Rayman on Jaguar has been an absolute delight for me in all the ways it differs from the PlayStation and Saturn versions. I never thought I'd be going to my grave having played it, but now I can gladly say that I will. Just need to get me that Nannermobile and my bucket list is gonna be sitting real pretty. Now, while I've been selling the console short in terms of more pure exclusives, it still has some pretty notable games. Alien vs. Predator is probably the biggest one that the system is known for, a very ambitious game that has 3 separate campaigns, each with their own unique mechanics and controls that even have their own controller overlays. One for the Colonial Marine, one for the Alien, and one for the Predator. Pretty neat and definitely an interesting game. Then there's Super Burnout here, a game that I find to be very technically impressive as well as a lot of fun to play with Sega hang-on vibes going for it. But then there is what I might consider to be the overall best game for the system, Tempest 2000, which, yeah, there's a version of it on the Saturn, but I still think it's best on the Atari Jaguar. And believe me, I only say the Saturn was bested by something when I'm absolutely forced to. But what an awesome game. Going back to Atari's arcade roots, this game doesn't try to do too much. Just be a really fun game with arcade sensibilities, and it nails it, making it one of the more replayable games for the system, as well as a game that makes the system worth having. Now, as I like to do, we gotta compare the controllers. For those who crave a push-button keypad on their controllers, you are in luck. Something that many might have thought had been abandoned since consoles of the 80s like the ColecoVision. Atari said, not to worry, we got your back. With a keypad that pays homage to a telephone, the only disappointment is that they didn't go full cool rotary dial. Just think of how sick that would have been for time-sensitive platform jumping. But in fairness, these extra buttons are typically not used for anything critical, and in some cases, for much of anything at all, even the ones that have overlays, which inspired me to make my own overlays. Everyone loves a compliment, so I figured, why not? In any case, to control most games, you'll be left to use a pretty standard D-pad and 3 buttons. A D-pad and buttons that I would say definitely do not feel as good as the Genesis and Super Nintendo's. Not bad, they're still okay and usable, can provide some fun, just not amazing. And really, that's the Atari Jaguar. It's my favorite console among the consoles that are sort of good. I would never recommend it instead of the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, but in addition to them, sure. And while we're suggesting additions, why not some nanners? The Atari Jaguar is part of the 90s, which I feel is a very worthwhile period in gaming, a time when oddball consoles tried their luck. Many of them failed, but they provide a bit of intrigue and fun for us retro gamers nowadays. Also, some of you are probably wondering why I never talked about the CD attachments, and it's only because some people consider them to be their own thing. But they do exist, and I'll certainly be talking about them in other videos. But there we have it, how I think the Atari Jaguar stacks up to the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. As always, I would love to hear what your thoughts are, so leave a comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's